This pie dough is buttery, flaky, and honestly much easier to make than most people think. It's perfect for quiche, pot pies, sweet pies, and just about anything else you want to bake. In this video, I'm going to take my time and walk you through the entire process step by step, from making the dough to baking it. The first thing we're going to do is weigh out our dry ingredients. If you don't already have a scale, I'd highly recommend getting one. It makes baking much more consistent and precise. You can absolutely bake using volume measurements like cups and teaspoons, but using weight is just far more accurate. I'll give both weight and volume measurements in the recipe so you can use whichever you prefer. This is a very buttery, flaky pie dough. There's a little sugar in it, but it's not a sweet dough. It just helps round out the flavor. This dough works great for both savory and sweet pies, and even for sweet pies, this is still the dough that I use as my go-to. The texture is buttery, flaky, and really rich. Now we've already added our flour, sugar, and salt, and now we're just going to mix that together with a fork. Keep in mind this is a double batch since I'm making multiple quiches. The recipe I'm actually sharing with you makes just 2 pie crusts. So that's why this looks like so much. Once the dry ingredients are mixed, we can move on to the butter. One thing I like to do is put the butter in the freezer for a little while beforehand. Typically about 30 minutes to an hour before I'm going to cut it. You really want the butter to stay nice and cold. I also prefer mixing the butter in by hand rather than using a pastry cutter or some kind of attachment, so having the butter extra cold really helps a lot. The reason you want to keep the butter cold is because those small pieces of butter are what create those flaky layers in the dough. As the pie bakes, the water inside the butter turns into steam. That steam pushes apart the layers of dough and creates that nice, light, flaky texture. If the butter gets too warm or gets completely mixed into the flour, you lose those little pockets of butter. And without those pockets, the dough bakes up more dense and less flaky. That's also why you don't want to overwork the dough. The more you handle it, the warmer the butter gets and the more the gluten develops, which can make the crust tougher. That's also why the scraps are never quite as good as the first time you roll the dough out. The more you work it and re-roll the scraps and use them up, the more gluten develops. It also starts picking up more flour as you work with it, which can dry the dough out and make it even tougher. Cut the butter into a medium dice. From there, we're just going to use our fingers to slowly press and work the butter into the flour. If you've never made pie dough before, this stage can feel a little strange. It's going to seem very dry at first, and it's not really supposed to come together yet. We're just working the butter down into smaller pieces throughout the flour. You're looking for a texture that's almost like coarse sand. The reason we toss the butter in the flour first is so each piece gets lightly coated. That flour helps separate the butter and keeps it from clumping together into one large mass. It also helps distribute the butter more evenly throughout the dough. This part does take a little bit of time, and instead of cutting ahead in the video, I wanted to show you what the whole process actually looks like. This is a very simple recipe to make, it just takes a little patience to do it properly. Once we have the texture we're looking for, we can start adding the water. And again, this dough is still going to look pretty dry at this stage. It's not going to look like a smooth dough yet. You're really looking for larger clumps starting to form throughout the mixture. It should still have that coarse, wet, sandy texture with some bigger pieces holding it together just barely. This is just about the texture we're looking for. It's just starting to come together, but it's still not fully mixed, which is exactly what we want. We'll transfer this to our work surface and gently press it together until it forms one mass. We're just going to knead this very lightly here. If it starts sticking to the work surface, you can add a small amount of flour. But you really don't want to add any more than necessary. You're just trying to get the dough to barely come together here. Once the dough comes together, we'll form it into one log and divide it into portions. I'm cutting this into 4 pieces because I'm making a double batch, but the recipe that I'm actually sharing with you just makes 2 pie doughs. Once they're portioned, wrap each one individually and refrigerate them for a few hours. It's really important to let the dough rest before rolling it out. This gives the gluten time to relax. If you try rolling it out right away, the dough will keep shrinking back as you roll it and it feels like you're not making any progress. Letting it rest makes it much easier to work with. Now that the dough has rested for a few hours, we can start rolling it out. I'll start by lightly flouring my work surface, and I also like to warm the dough slightly with my hands first, just because it makes it a little bit easier to work with. Now that the dough is out of the plastic wrap, you can really start to see those pieces of butter through the dough, and that's actually a good thing. Those large pieces of butter are what help create flaky layers when the dough bakes. So don't worry if you still see them. This dough will be a little difficult to roll out at first since it's pretty cold, but as it warms up slightly, it will get much easier to work with. And we're just trying to roll it thin enough to fully cover the pie dish. You don't want to overwork it, and you also don't want it sticking to the surface. You want to just add just enough flour that it doesn't start sticking everywhere. That's why you'll see me flipping it over pretty often. I'm just making sure it's not sticking as I roll it out. And we'll just keep working the dough until it's large enough to fit the dish we're using. If you're using a different shaped dish like a square pan, you just want to make sure that that shape is going to fit it, so you'd be rolling it in a square. We're just going to slowly roll this out until it reaches the thickness we want and it's large enough to fully cover the dish. Last week I used this dough to make a quiche, and next week I'll be using it again for chicken pot pie. This dough works equally well for savory recipes and sweet pies too. As you're rolling the dough out, just keep an eye out for any cracks or small tears that might start to form. If it happens, it's really not a big deal. You can just press the dough back together with your fingers and keep on rolling. Once the dough is rolled out large enough to fit the pan, we'll carefully lift it up and slide the pan underneath. Then gently press the dough down into the pan so it fully covers the entire surface. I'm using a fluted pan here, which makes this process a little easier. What I like to do is press the dough firmly into all the inside edges of the pan. I'll also press along the top edge of the fluting as well. It just helps keep the dough from shrinking too much toward the center as it bakes. Once the dough is pressed into the pan, you can actually freeze it at this stage and bake it whenever you want. But since I'm making quiche, I'm going to go ahead and bake these right away. I'll show you that process next. Now we'll use a fork to poke holes across the bottom of the dough. This step is really important. If you skip it, the dough can puff up as it bakes and won't stay flat in the center. By making these holes, it helps release that steam and it keeps the crust from rising too much while it bakes. Baking the crust is a two-step process. First, line the dough with parchment paper and fill it with baking beans or pie weights. The weights help keep the crust from puffing up while it bakes. They also help the dough cook more evenly without getting too brown too quickly. I'm using pie weights here, but dried beans work just as well. Garbanzo beans, pinto beans, or whatever you have on hand are all fine. Bake this at 375 degrees for about 7 to 10 minutes or until the center no longer looks raw. Then remove it from the oven and carefully take out the parchment paper and the pie weights. Once that's done, it's time for the second step. Now we'll return the crust to the oven to blind bake it. This step just helps fully cook the crust and gives it that golden brown color. This will bake for another 7 to 10 minutes. The reason we do this is so the crust fully cooks before adding any filling. If you skip this step, the bottom can stay soft and undercooked once the pie is filled. Blind baking also helps the crust stay flaky and crisp instead of turning soggy. And this is how my quiche turned out with this dough. Perfectly golden brown, buttery, and flaky around the edges. Make sure you tune in next week because I'll be using the same dough again for a chicken pot pie. And as always, if you enjoy videos like this, make sure you subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.